welcome. I'm here together with one of Hanzi's Meat Space avatars, Daniel Görtz, and also my partner on the integral stage, Layman. And we're gathering to have a pretty open-ended dialogue, I think, around questions of inclusion and exclusion, and especially perceptions, social perceptions around integral theory and the integral movement and its strengths, but also some of its missteps. And so I was first inspired to kind of call this conversation together recently when I was working with some others to organize a forum that was ideally aiming to bridge multiple communities and be a dialogical space for multiple adjacent movements to meet and collaborate and discuss things. And I heard a number of times repeated, some people saying, if this is going to be associated with Ken Wilber or integral, I don't really want to be part of that. And that made me think back on some earlier conversations, I think mostly with David Long, where David Long had said that Hanzi or Daniel had referred to integral as a poisoned chalice. And I didn't recall Daniel actually saying that anywhere, but I went back and I found an interview last night that I listened to, and it was actually Joe Lightfoot that first used the word, and then David and Daniel both picked up on it and kind of unpacked it in terms of what it might mean. And so that's where I'd like to start. I think we can branch out into broader considerations of general social dynamics and things like that. But I'd really like to open it up first by asking you, Daniel, what was your association with integral, and what really prompted you to feel it was important to distance yourself from it? And do you relate to that still, to that poison chalice metaphor?
Mm-hmm. I actually didn't recognize the poison chalice metaphor when you brought it up, except, as a concept, I've used another one to the same effect, but that wasn't, I think, talking about integral. I think I talked about Jordan Peterson stuff or something. I said it's a milkshake with gravel in it, right? A vegan milkshake, right? You can make delicious vegan milkshake. So anyway, so I do very much recognize that feeling, that mixed feeling about it, that it's something wondrous, but there's also something about it which makes it in many contexts more or less unusable, right? So that's, I suppose, the position more and more people are coming to, and then people are either trying to clean out the gravel or they're trying to make it a milkshake, basically. So my own story with integral begins in 2008. I'm 25 at the time, and I go to India to meditate, to turn around a long existential crisis that's been in my life for many years, right? And I have a fairly alienated friend. She even worked as a luxurious prostitute. That's the sort of friends I kept. And she said, well, I have this guru guy or martial arts guy who you might want to talk to about going to India and stuff. He knows all about it and all meditation ashrams and stuff. And I also thought I'd do some reading. I made a list of 50 books or something, and I crossed. I had like 5, I think. And I thought it was Dostoevsky and Habermas or something that was left on the list. And this guy, the guru guy, writes to me, well, if you're interested in these sorts of topics and you're a sociologist, you might want to look into Ken Wilber stuff. And I looked it up, and I actually threw that list out. So I didn't end up bringing Habermas and Dostoevsky to India at that point. I brought Wilber books, and you walk around in these suggestive environments, like all these awesome temples. And if you've never been to India before and you travel around for months, it's a very full experience. And of course, I, for the first time, started doing serious meditation practice and all of that. And in that environment, just reading these Wilbur books, I read A.H. Alma's stuff as well. And, just before I did finish an education in sociology, and I kind of had this intuition, wow, there's some kind of pattern to the different theories, but like a mind greater than my own could somehow put them together. They're non-arbitrarily related. Maybe this could be my life's work somehow. Well, and there it was, right? And there was a very, very powerful pattern. It had great explanatory power. It was super elegant. It simplified stuff and nevertheless made things more succinct. You could move across the disciplines. You could even, integrate stuff like meditation, like just pure phenomenology, fit into the models. It wasn't like this woo weird thing out there. It was integrated in a comprehensible manner into this same world view. So this stuff absolutely blew my mind. My brain at this point, I was a young person. It just sucked it up like a sponge. Right. It's like it just went to my spine, just recoded the way I saw the world. Eventually went back to academia and stuff. I started applying some of the models, and I found, whatever course you were taking, whatever topic, you could get to not whatever topic, but in a surprising amount of topics, you could get to the heart of the conversation fast, and you could top the perspectives of the leaders of the field. And I did that again and again. Or that's what that was not just what it seemed like in my mind, but also in the minds of others. People like, where is this coming from? Right. So that's also where I felt that this stuff really hits the fan. Or like, no, this is real rubber hitting the road, right? This stuff works with skin in the game. It's not, for a while, you think you're crazy, and it's just going to look like that in your mind. So eventually I found other integralists, etc., and I started working towards creating some kind of integral shift in society, or make society, of course, the developmental perspectives, which I initially resisted, I more and more found explain things in my life. I really, for a fairly non-religious person, it was close to a religious awakening, right? And also it gave me the mandate to explore much more openly and voraciously, and with a greater sense of the potentials. Was kind of my opening also, my entry ticket into more serious spiritual practice, right? So, that's step one. Then I worked with it for years, and all of those things happened in the years that followed. There were stuff that Wilbur had said and done. There were these incidents with cults. I discovered there was also a past with cult abuses that had not been properly dealt with. I also discovered there was when you try to use this as a political theory or social theory for social change, there were certainly gaps that had to be filled, right? And I kind of rediscovered some of the more basic sociology that I had earlier worked with, and felt, well, there were gaps to fill here, or ways to update this theory, especially if you want to use it for changing the world, right? And most of all, it repelled, like, if you try to explain the theory or reference the social context and so forth, it repelled all mainstream people, like non-spiritual people, and not for such a bad reason. It actually did have, given that this stuff grew in and through the New Age communities, right? And it still carried that DNA, right? So even though it was viewed as the critical voice or the intellectual voice or the voice that marries through sense and soul, or reason and spirituality, science, spirituality, science and religion, it was still marked by that background, and not least in the crowd it attracted and the needs that were that people were trying to fill with this space, right? So people were attracted to Integral often because Integral was a ticket to make their spiritual journeys and intuitions and just occult journeys and stuff like that more legit in a modern, rational, secular society. And so many of the integralist followers were in it specifically for that ingredient. So when I tried to build, a political movement in Sweden around these things, and Denmark a little bit, well, things got fairly new agey pretty quickly, right? And very focused on the inner dimensions, right? That's, people were drawn to this stuff for its focus on the inner dimensions. And it eventually, if you weigh the whole thing, right, and so strong in that direction that so many people are there to fulfill this particular need, when you then go, okay, and how do we, let's look at the system side. What's the dialectic that will drive the economy, blah, 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 and how does that interact? And people, after a while, well, they nod, but after a while they get bored with it. And they say, okay, sure, but when do we do the real stuff? The meditation, and then, meditation is the legit part, but from there on, they want to go farther. And before long, you're sitting there arguing with people about, like, you invite people to have this inclusive discussion about changing society and have a deliberation that takes all these different perspectives, but you end up talking with people about why astrology and certain forms of magical thinking aren't meaningful to be using as a contemporary political project, right? And why those things, can and should be kept in the private space, and rather than be part of the public sphere. So, well, I just felt, a bit like a stranded whale in the whole thing, right? Like, I really wanted this spirituality part, and I thought, well, wow, this is key to the future of society, humanity, et cetera, et cetera. So that was one part. The other part of the criticism comes from, there's this sense that we all have, people who are spiritually inclined, that the transformation is possible, including radical transformation, right? And I really sense that, like, I just sit right, I just, going through some stuff right now, and just sitting down doing a proper forgiveness meditation. Like, I can really sense this. If you work these things, you make it a habit of your mind to forgive people. And it's a spiritual practice with deep psychological underpinnings, but really spiritual practice, or other things that I do, right, that I feel are real, that I feel real practices. This was a very, very strong realization for me. And I also kind of felt that spirituality reflected in Wilber's writings and in the writings of other people. And then, but what I noticed around the communities was that I started to have unreasonably high expectations of myself, but also of people around me. Because, like, wow, but you're this integral person, right? You work through your shadows, and you do this and that, and you can take all of these multiple perspectives. But I mean, after years and years working with people, things just go awry sometimes and go south, and there are vicious dynamics, and people start blaming each other for not, being mindful or whatever, or for having egos or all these things, right? And it's like, wait a minute, you guys are you're the same as as the kind of people I grew up with and I'm used to. It's the same old humanity, right? And this is what it said in all the books, right? Like, oh, it's not, this can be this new man, or actually Wilbur does use that term sometimes, a new man, a new woman, etc. But I guess just my expectations had gone up too much. But when it got down to it, it was just the same old stuff, right? Same old dynamics, power struggles, blah blah blah, and just in other guises, and sometimes more vicious guises, right? So all of this together kind of got me, well, just on the skeptic side of this, right? So from being really an acolyte of sorts, if not necessarily openly so, but in spirit, right? To being, I don't know, a Reformed Protestant or something of the Integral Church, right? And I guess I can stop there. There's a chapter 2 to this with metamodernism stuff, but yeah, does my story resonate with the both of you, or either one of you?
Lots of parts I relate to in that. I think I don't think I came into it either to the community or the philosophy or to my practice with unreasonably high expectations. And I think that's one of the reasons I've felt okay most of the time, but I've seen that all around me. I've seen it both in individuals relative to their feeling of what their practice and what their beliefs mean about them, that they're at the leading edge of evolution, right? And they start to get into this culture where you can't help but become fragile and crash when you've got that kind of distortion. And also the kinds of branding and marketing that have been associated with Ken Wilber's kind of integrative pluralism has been a little bit too positive, futuristic, American, feel good, clean. And that sets up a dichotomy so that when there are normal human problems, it seems like it undermines that. Whereas I think one of the things, one of the reasons Bruce and I have been able to sort of spread across these communities is we're not doing a hard sell. We're not trying to set up a really positive image that gets undermined. We're trying to be very loose and fluid and human and messy. So there's not something to counterbalance there. When I came into the community, I thought, oh, this is an example of something, right? When Bruce and I talked to Ken Wilber a few months ago, I said to him, you're the mark to beat, right? Like the future of this kind of thinking has to be at least as good as what you did. But that means that I'm thinking of a space in which people are doing this, and he's an example of that. So I've always been thinking about that space. And one of the things that goes on in that space, I think, is a tension between comprehensiveness and specialization. And he tried to be so comprehensive that it's amazing, but you can't help but also specialize. So early on, when people would ask me questions like, what's the relationship between integral and metamodernism? One of the things I would say is, well, metamodernism is a stripped down sociopolitical integralism, and integral is a scaled up psychospiritual metamodernism, right? Because you can't help but specialize no matter how comprehensive you have to be. And so everybody in these spaces is going to be in that tension somehow of trying to include everything, but actually they want to work on certain things more than others. Bruce?
Yeah, maybe I can interject.
Oh, yeah, please.
Well, actually, I really like that distinction. Like, yeah, you could say metamodernism is a stripped down sociopolitical integralism, and roughly speaking, it's a more conservative integralism, right? So, like, oh, why just modernity and post-modernity? Well, because we didn't get that integration right yet. So why do all of the other ones at the same time? Let's start there, and then adding the third part, traditionalism or whatever, is going to be a whole new game, right? So it's a more conservative stance in that sense, and it says yes, spirituality is real, but it's not gonna get everybody into a spiritual cosmic orgasm by Friday morning. Rather, it's more reformist, that well, if given the research by Richard Davidson and Daniel Goleman, for instance, if this stuff can be worked through institutions, etc., critically minded, we get higher quality data. Where not all the researchers are necessarily proponents of meditation themselves. These sorts of things, right? They can help slide the scale. We can create little protopias, little utopias with an EU, little good places where higher states or spiritual states can flourish and then maybe vanish before things get too rigid or too culty. And I mean, just the aesthetics, right? Maybe the future of humanity, it'll be perfectly reasonable to make everyday life about galaxies and everything in violet, right? Ultraviolet, but at this point, it makes sense to be more suggestive, to be more implicit, to have this new sincerity or ironic sincerity, rather than to be like new age-ishly in your face aesthetically, right? So an aesthetic reformation, a politicization. So of course, adding much political theory on my end, but there are other versions of metamodernism, as you know. But that's kind of how I term that. But you said more succinctly. Yeah, Bruce.
I think I also never went fully into integral and a total buy-in that this is going to be everything for me, but I did get pretty enthusiastic about it for a while, to the degree that I went to go get a degree in it. And it was actually at Ken Wilber's house, where our cohort from the school went to spend a weekend with him and talk to him about some questions and topics. And I remember being a little uncomfortable with some of his humor, and it didn't personally offend me, but I thought, this is not going to work very well, given all the scandals with different gurus and things like that, if you're putting this too much out there, and people are not going to receive it very well. And so I ended up being quoted by somebody who was doing a takedown book of Wilber, and I wasn't intending that. I was just saying he should be a little cautious. He's in front of university students talking about certain things that, in the wrong context could give a bad name to integral. And so from the beginning, I've had both some critical distance from some of those things. I used to, when I was participating on the forums, I said, is this integral for kids? Because the aesthetic was really aimed at like early 20-something-year-old people. And so I was feeling what you were talking about, that aesthetic dimension of it. I did find a lot in there, working with Sean Hargens and some other people, going, Mark Foreman and other people, going pretty deep into the theoretical side of things, and ended up working on my own meta theory projects and trying to go deep with its post-metaphysical emphases and really looking into the core literature around post-metaphysics, and that brought me into a whole philosophical journey of about 10 years of really exploring all of those sources. And I think where I ended up sitting eventually is considering myself as part of like an integral diaspora, people who had been kind of trained and raised within integral thinking and then spreading out in their different directions. And I know Benita Roy and other people have kind of used those terms, Tom Murray, where we would have been influenced by integral, but we're not solely rooted in it. But I still find a lot in it that's really valuable. And that's, we're doing our channel still primarily rooted in identification with that movement. I actually have an opportunity now, academically and otherwise, possibly to actually contribute more substantially to the actual movement itself. So I've had this kind of in and out dance with it. And I know it's probably a bit ironic for me to talk about me being uncomfortable with some of the humor that Wilber was doing when I went on years later to create a forum that was one of the reasons you were even considering the term, Poisoned Chalice. in terms of what kind of presentation is coming from at least some quarters within the integral movement. And yeah, I think it's a concern, especially if you're looking to get something moving socially in a really a mainstream context where you're wanting to make political changes and or interface with mainstream religious communities. There's a lot of stuff around the edges and sometimes even closer to the center of integral that will give people pause and make it difficult to, at least there'd be a number of hurdles to get over to be able to establish trust and and possibilities for collaboration or being taken seriously. So I recognize those issues and see the reasoning behind, the kind of distancing and differentiation that you've attempted or that David Long and some others have been calling for.
Yeah, I'd like to respond a little bit to your story as well, Bruce. So beginning with, well, maybe just start here, that the future of, yeah, well, there's the saying, the future Buddha will be a Sangha, right? And we're part of this research project as well that tries to bring together meta theorists and meta theories. It's still trying to incorporate, etc., and finding its feet and defining its direction. But yeah, I mean, the next Ken Wilber will likely be a Sangha, also of a meta theory. I mean, Ken Wilber's feat was singular, at the same time it came with all the limitations of a single person. And I think it's then symptomatic of that kind of inclusive movement that I don't think there are almost any self-identified integralists anymore. It's kind of like postmodernism. It's all over the place, but nobody's a postmodernist, right? And with integral, well, it's smaller than postmodernists, but all the integralists aren't. Integralists were, metamodernists or diaspora, etc. But scratch the surface. We actually are integralists, more or less. It's just that kind of movement that was fairly monolithically following Wilber that existed 15 years ago or 10 years ago, well, almost doesn't exist anymore. So rather, we're trying to be integral in the sense meta-theoretical, holistic, developmentally aware, if not necessarily married to certain developmental models, also with greater openness to non-developmentalists. Well, so if we say that, well, if integral was kind of a melting, like kind of by a fork or a point where everything kind of came together in one person, in one setting, etc. And there, a lot of interesting things happen and kind of explodes in many, many, many different directions. Some of which go, really south. So cults, far right stuff, lonely people being in telepathic communication with Wilber via YouTube, etc., etc., etc. Suicides, unfortunately, as well. Two more productive sides, right? So we've kind of been through this focal point, or like explosion or fusion or something, right? And then it produces all sorts of new elements, right? And those elements are now being differentiated, and not all those elements deserve to live. If we take let's about what happened with what's it called, the herpes salon, right? Was the name of your forum. Well, I think to many of our listeners, it's fairly well known that far right stuff kind of infiltrated it, right? Eventually, and like, which, I mean, when you started out as integral thinker and follower of these ideas, nothing seemed more foreign, right? Because like, well, this is from the progressive side, and it's now we're getting even more progressive, even more developed, etc. The Nazis were a long way back, and they were regressive and pre-modern, etc. And like, integral Nazis, psychedelic Nazis, what the fuck? And when and I was horrified, and my stuff also showed up in all reading lists on fascist websites, on Russian geopolitics websites, you name it. But it's not so weird, right? If Metamodernism integral says, hey, pomos, we've had enough of postmodernism, we're going to do something else. It's going to be holistic, it's going to be organic, it's going to be hopeful, it's going to be progressive, not just in the sense critical. It's going to also revive tradition of religion in a meaningful way. Well, so if you are against postmodernism, you're also against the modern world. Revolt against the modern world is like the title of Julius Evola's book, right? The far right thinker, far right mysticism, and so you're like against POMO, and you want to take it a further step, and you want to revive. Well, so that becomes radical conservatives, right? So it's eerily close, right? And then we say, well, so then hierarchies can be good. And they're like, yes, we like hierarchies. And then we get all of these strange bedfellows, and we kind of have to struggle to disentangle from all of these. Yeah, and they're sticky, man. They're sticky. They don't leave you alone. They're right, and they infiltrate our forums, and they so much want to be part of this, and they flatter, and I by mistake was on White Power, on a White Power podcast once. I had no idea that was what it was until I read the commentaries from people who were following it. They're like, is this guy pro-white at all? I bet this guy's a fucking Jew. Well, yeah. So anyway, yeah. Just wanted to share those thoughts that I think we kind of, even though we call ourselves other things, we also are integral, but just in this expanded sense, which was maybe the fate of integral to begin with. One of the first things that I needed to do when I became associated with the community was to distinguish between what I called integralists and integralites. All right. And so there are people who have these ideas and identify with them regardless of what their internal situation is. And there's other people who have found these things in themselves, right? People who have their own vision, logic, experience, whether they've ever heard of these ideas or not. So which one do we think is the real integral community, right? Ultimately, it's got to be the one that isn't just the branded organization. And once you start thinking about that, you realize that the theory itself tells us that this should be the case. And I found that was one of the limitations, is that people don't often apply the ideas of the theory to themselves or to the community. Right, because we would expect the community would be full of people at different stages using the same concepts for different things, right? Whether there'll be postmoderns there who think it's postmodernism, and modernists who think it's a rejection of postmodernism, and conservatives who think that it's some kind of return to magical pre-rational hierarchy. And they're going to be also doing this on different developmental lines, and they're all going to have their shadow, and they're going to be imbalanced between the systems and the interpersonal and the personal and the material. The theory says that will be the case. That's what we should expect. But we show up and we kind of pretend that's not the case, that everything should be great. And then we're shocked that it turns out that the people are behaving exactly the way the theory describes people as behaving. But we have a little bit of a problem in actually retroactively applying it to ourselves when we're in a community with people. I think there's also
there's a real time frame issue, which is to say, we go, well, has integral failed? Well, if it was AD 40, you would think, well, Christianity's failed. It's definitely not catching on in the Roman Empire, right? And so you don't know what it's going to look like in 200 or 500 years. But at the same time, we have concerns right now about changing the world, and we can't wait to see how it turns out in 500 years. So integral's kind of caught in the crosshairs between those two timing issues.
So I'd be a little bit harsher. I would say it kind of has failed, as if the project is this particular brand to kind of find its way into the center of human thinking and there begin to integrate all strands of human thoughts and knowledge in a productive, actionable manner, then we kind of did, or it kind of did fail, right?
I agree. Well, it's certainly on our time scale. We don't know what it looks like 1,000 years in the future looking back, right? But for our lives, it's kind of failed for our lives.
I guess then as such, then it has still, succeeded in bringing a lot of meaning to a lot of people and a lot of community, and it has stimulated a truckload of things, right? So of course, Christianity in AD is not necessarily the Christianity that actually took over the Roman Empire. It mutated pretty fast in the first centuries, right?
Yeah, there's a question for people. I think everybody should ask themselves what it is they think integral was good for, right? Because for me, like I say, Wilber is a great example of a kind of thing I'm interested in and that I do, which is some kind of integrative meta thinking. I think his attempt to clarify and popularize this was an excellent attempt, but more and more, or maybe since the beginning, I've usually felt that the most important thing was that it acted as a public flag, right? It stood out in public, and so that people could come together. And when they came together, they could find each other. And in all that finding, some of the people who were actually doing it found each other. And that in hindsight, I think of that as the most important function that it performed.
I think it's a pretty common dynamic for there to be movements, whether religious or political, and then differentiations within it and splitting off into new denominations, new political parties. And that can be pretty generative in terms of, allowing for new forms of differentiation and new types of creative effort to flower within these different, contexts. So I think that can be welcomed even by the original community to see that kind of diversity and diversification happening. Historically, sometimes the original entity will close ranks around its core principles and get defensive and paranoid. Sometimes it will take the differentiation as an opportunity for self-critique and possibly adjust itself and change itself to try to maintain relevance. You can think about how many times the Catholic Church, for instance, has been reinventing itself to try to maintain relevance, throughout history, as there have been different branchings off. So I think, we can expect these things and that it's not necessarily a problem. And it may be that integral was a seedbed for other things that are going to grow, and whatever integral was under Ken Wilber's aegis will fade, or at least it won't be the Integral Institute going on, or it could. There may be some kind of, evolution within itself to try to maintain relevance and respond to actually what's being voiced in all of the surrounding communities. From my side, I don't know how either of you look at it, but from my side, and I think what we're trying to do on the integral stage is, while recognizing this differentiation happening and welcoming it, there's the potential for energy to be diminished and collective efforts to be diminished if they're branching off in a lot of different directions and people are no longer trusting each other or communicating. So from my perspective, there's no evangelical interest in spreading integral anywhere in terms of you've got to have this brand. But I think there's a need for making common cause among these relatively closely aligned communities in terms of values and insights into what our essential problems are. And so that, I think that's part of our effort here at the integral stage is, let there be these 1,000 flowers blooming, and let's continue to make common cause to some degree.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, a lot of things coming up. For me, I think what's going on with thinking in terms of future developments of meta theory, I think within our farther grasp or sight, there are significant updates possible to Wilber's theories that would be, and a lot of people come around and say, well, I've done this, I've done that. There are all of these updates. Some people call metamodernism post-integral, but there's been actually a misunderstanding around that, because what I'm talking about and other people are talking about usually is after postmodernism, you have either integralism or metamodernism, can kind of call it different things, and it's post-integral in the sense that it came after integral on the calendar. But I think the new kind of prism that needs to emerge is a more thorough and more careful meta theory, right? So I think that the project we're involved in has promise there. I also see over recent years that I think I'm noticing more fruitful developments in core theory than I did earlier. Earlier, you'd have these different ideas. Well, you could do a secularized version of it. You could, people would switch around the models a little bit. They'll make corrections. But I think we are closing in on something more comprehensive that also would perhaps link to stuff like chaos theory and chaos and complexity at large, and perhaps also link closer to the natural sciences. These things are possible to achieve. There are patterns that are discoverable that go across these things, and you don't necessarily have to think of them in a very Platonic way, right? These are enactable patterns or something like that, right? With some kind of both and of Aristotle and Plato there. And until we get to that point, the new inflection point, I think it's almost unavoidable that things are going to spread, right? Because given all of the different openings, given that, it opened a truckload of doors, this stuff, right? Some people go deep into spirituality, open that door for them. Some people, start applying it in business. Some people think this is the best weapon against the evil postmodernists, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, do we even want to gather all of those things, right? And if we're inclusive, then we don't have very strong membranes. It means we get easier to hack, or meaning that, memetically infectious diseases like far right stuff, etc., which still have their partial truths for all matter. Of course, but which actually do draw destructive and manipulative behaviors from people, right? Those can more and more easily enter. And the things we're up against is not just the Nazis. UFOs, more and more, right? And I'm sure you guys are very familiar with a lot of people who are very interested in UFOs and stuff like that. I think you've even had it on your show, right? And you have magical thinking in all of its guises, right? And you have and of course the cults too, always. Just ran into one last summer. My website was hacked by a cult, etc. We may need to, at this point, not be too inclusive. We need to, I think, move towards stronger discernment, right? The clearer vision in this vision logic, or whatever you want to say, or that's kind of where the sense I'm getting these days. And there's also all of this suffering that's just coming out of all this confusion, right? A friend writes, and she says, well, I found this thing, somebody's channeling Ra, the sun god, and look at this model, it's really nice. Yeah, I mean, yeah, sure, there was something integralish about the model, and they probably had a real intuition, or they may have picked up ideas from elsewhere. But you're not actually channeling the sun god. And the person actually also did kill themselves afterwards, and they did believe themselves to be the world teacher. So, I mean, like we need medicine against that. So we need vaccines or whatever, right, against that sort of stuff, because it destroys people, right? And once you've said, okay, somebody can channel the sun god, well, anybody can show up if they're persuasive enough. They're like, I'm channeling the moon god, dude. And it's like, wow, I got into some high states by following this moon god channeler. And by the way, you know what's holding you back? Your family. I mean, and it always happens, right? So I'm thinking the future needs to be a little, you know, my old self would have said, oh, that's interesting. Good on you, the sun god. If you think that's interesting, go and see where it takes you. Now I say, be very careful. You might be harming yourself and other people, including your family, if you go farther in this direction. You are opening up not Alice's Wonderland, just a rabbit hole, and it goes to kind of spirituality. And this stuff grows so fast on the web, right? It has so many followers, and you know they're just, and they're using a lot of the same language now. They're just detaching a whole continent of reference, right, from the public sphere, and they're creating their own reference universe with other rules of engagement, and you know, and it's absolutely awful. You know, it's authoritarian. It is super aggressive. It is manipulative. It is commercialized at the same time. It is violent. It wears you down psychologically. It breaks up families. Like that sort of shit is awful, and we need to be very, very careful not to contribute to those sorts of things, right? So then that's why I think the future really is in better theory, right? Which is why I love that you guys are committed to that as well, even if you're also committed to being open and exploring and turning all the stones, right? Yeah. Well, that's why, by the way, if we get into that conspirituality stuff, we're talking poisoned chalice, right? It's not even a chalice anymore. You threw away the chalice. You up to here, right, in the poison.
I mean, I touched on this last time, like the problem of separating the mental and verbal constructs from the level at which they're being used is really important. And the traditional way human beings have gotten together is pretend they all mean the same things by the same words. But these kind of models at the level we're talking about, have to make it clear that when two people say the word God, they might be talking about vastly different things. And we need to be looking at how they're having that discussion, and that line blurs constantly. So like, you know, if we talk about UFOs or anomalous phenomenon or going to have people on, it's a very fine line to walk, right? Because obviously this could be pre-rational nonsense in terms of how it's being described, or you could be talking to a very interesting person who's got a transrational take, and you don't know until you really get into it with them which way they're leaning. So it's very appropriate to do those explorations, but it's also appropriate to be cautious about that. I think a lot of the work we're all doing in terms of meta theory space has to understand the role of classical and intuitive supermodels, like the kinds of things that gave rise to a lot of the mystical traditions. People are still doing that work. They're still trying to super connect all the areas of their own experience. And that might be good for them internally, but it doesn't produce something that's externally useful to others. And you have to be careful with it. I appreciate what you were saying there, Daniel. I think there's a need for a new kind of hygiene. If you want to say to people, look, okay, explore these things and cross-connect parts of your own experience, that's good. But here's where you need to be careful. Here's where you might need to tweak that. Here's where we all need to develop a wisdom of defense against cognitive biases and manipulators and a marketing culture and technological algorithms, because all kinds of things are trying to hack us. And how do we know the difference between our inspired, intuitive, experiential connections and just being hacked by ourselves or someone else or the system? So that's going to be increasingly serious each day we go forward. We have to really take that seriously. I liked what you were saying, Bruce, about bringing together, but also allowing the diversity. I think there is a role for creative divergence and reconsolidation or solidarity. And we have to sort of get that right in various ways. And like Daniel was saying, there'll be a spot at which a really big new consolidation is possible, right? If we can say what the overarching principles are of all the people who are trying to make the integrative meta models, then we have something that's like what Wilber did, but at the next level. And that will be really helpful in addressing all of these things, right? So there's the consolidation and divergence, non-duality in theory, and then also in the communities. We have to manage both of those. I think we are working toward having a new mandala that will give us confidence and clarity at a new scale. I think that's important. I also think there's something about the sort of as you sow, so shall you reap in the ethos that Wilber's temperament brought to all of this. All right, the way he is personally gave him the ability to do all this work, but also it's pushes people off, and he has different strangenesses like we all do. And one of the things he does is he likes to be casually dismissive. He likes to push off against things, right? This is integralism, and that was the postmodern cul-de-sac, right? And you kind of exaggerate the degree of difference. We don't have to worry about that one because we've got this one now. And I think that spreads through the community so that people naturally start to do that to him as well. And you go, well, that was the problematic integralism. This is integral 2.0 or something like that. Not to pick on David Long, because I think as off-putting to some people as David Long might be, that attempt to draw a really clear distinction about being at least rational, at least modern in the way we think about this is very important. But I think he's also an example of a general mood in the community where people feel like in order to secure some space for themselves and what they think is important, they have to push off against Wilber. And I think Wilber was doing that as well. He felt like a lot of his writing sounds like marginalizing denouncements of other groups of people. And that's understandable if you're trying to clarify a difference, but it also sets up an attitude that people will buy into going forward.
In terms of the making common cause, yeah, I definitely, one of the ongoing discussions I've had with David Long is whether he thinks that perhaps, though it's interesting, I think Layman is a bit made of Teflon compared to me, because Layman and I will both do the same thing on the channel, but David will come to me as the one not having standards for talking to such people, but never bring it up to Layman. But I actually agree that, we do need standards in that area. And for me, thinking about common cause, I'm actually thinking about generally communities that are on common enough ground, meaning, shared enough values and enough integrity and enough development. And so in that regard, I would, metamodernism and metamodernity and the various metamodernisms, game B, complex thought, critical realism. There's a, syntheism. There's a group of movements that have enough in common that I think they don't have to agree, but there could be some shared political and social ends that they can still collaborate on. And I think that's worth maintaining sufficient contact that we can nevertheless generate a kind of collective social force, even if we're not all in full alignment on a number of issues. Mm-hmm. For me, something like propertarianism is just a total no-go. I had no idea who they were when they were starting to infiltrate my forum, and once I got to know what it was, I ended up basically trying to kick people out, but ultimately shutting down the forum because I didn't know who was still lingering there that was going to continue trying to advocate for propertarianism. I thought it was too much work to moderate that and close the whole thing down. But yeah, I think, with proper standards in place and really paying attention to where there are significant alignments, the differentiation and even the combat is fine. And I think we can still get together on addressing climate issues and other kinds of things that are really important to us.
Yeah, I mean, there we certainly agree, and I think to give ourselves some credit as a community, I think we've come fairly far. If I just look at, and of course it's not just us, it's the internet, but if I look 15 years back or 10 years back, yeah, I mean, an integral community meant, a mailing list, maybe where there you would find a few other people who are really obsessed about Ken Wilber, and then we all got together and talked about how we're not that obsessed about Ken Wilber, and then we talk about changing the world and end up talking about how we may have had higher stages than other people. I mean, none of which I regret, was wonderful, but it wasn't all that, right? And you look at some of the same people now. Like I'm missing a meeting right now with one of the people I knew from that time. Christian Stolna is a researcher, Swedish researcher on adult development and other things. And he's right now, as we speak, leading a 40-strong cohort of researchers from around the world to talk about the field kit of the inner development goals, right? Which are now being adopted as a training program at the leadership level, the whole public sector in Costa Rica, and they have 5 other countries or something in tow, and we have, the Merge Gathering is happening now also in the United States. We have, I'm working towards a metamodern festival here, maybe getting EU money to doing that, and just the amalgamation of talent is just amazing, actually. If you just look at the internal forum of Metamodernists, you look across the different Facebook groups, you guys are going to hang out with the metamodern spirituality folks who are also doing amazing work. I think the whole network has really, through many of these partly painful iterations, but it has matured. People are doing a lot more sensible things now than they were. And it is at the same time more pluralistic and at the same time more coherent. So sometimes we don't see the forest for the trees. And even the cult thing, right? So Integral got into this whole big cult thing with Andrew Cohen. This thing had a freaking happy ending, which never happens. They're supposed to, then the cult collapses, and then a small community lives on a small island, and they become even more desperate, and then things get worse and worse from there on. No, they decapitated the cult leader, and they were like, okay, no more cult. It dissolved around the world because a certain threshold was reached in terms of information on the web. So, of course, it was the internet again, together with people. But the Integral community had something in it that most other communities that fall into these patterns do not. It had more critical thinking, right? And then people regretted all these mistakes. And 5 or 10 years on, a lot of people have moved on and done good things with how they healed from that, right? So if you look at it at that macro scale, and if you look not at, like you said formerly, Layman, if you look not at like Integral the brand, but people who are integral-ish, we're probably at a better place than we were, right? Or that's my sense, actually.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I'm glad you brought that up because there has been progress and there have been successes. The chalice is not entirely poisoned, right? People drinking from whatever this is, they have imbibed some essential nutrients. I think critical thinking is one of them, and I would put critical thinking in a set of things to not leave out. Like that's one way to think about what Wilber was doing and what all the meta-theorists are doing is saying, here are the things you shouldn't leave out. And then when you have that as a tool of thought, but also as a basis for communication with people, it's much easier for that discussion to say, well, what are we leaving out, right? Are we not being socially properly? Or maybe we have a great spiritual system, but are we being, is our social organization with each other somehow primitive? Or are we not being critical enough? Or are we not being intuitive enough? Or, right, that conversation that shifts around between those domains going on between people who say, yeah, we have to find some way to include and value these things, that's a smarter conversation. It can still lead to disasters, but it leads to fewer disasters because there's more things circulating in that conversation. I think that's really important, and we should, not get carried away, but congratulate ourselves a little bit on that and know that we're going in a good direction. There's a trajectory here that can work. I think the internet is a big part of that, because one way to think about Ken Wilber is as the last great embodiment of book culture, right? He's this sort of 70s, 80s, 90s, right up to the turn of the millennium. He, a master of books and the great author, scholar with his new system, the new Hegel, the new Plotinus. That basically kind of goes away. We can all still appreciate books and write books and use it to clarify, but it's not the same anymore in the instant digital network as our primary interface with information now. So there's been a change, and that change goes to community and it goes to network thinking. It goes to these new places. And I don't think we'll quite see another figure like that because that technological period is over. A couple other things that popped up in my mind going forward. I don't know how much time we're going to keep doing this discussion for, but the general question of exclusion and inclusion and how you set that membrane up and how you establish community spaces that are as inclusive as possible, but don't include the things that endanger people and undermine the space, and how you allow the space to take hits and be anti-fragile by growing in response to not trying to control everything, but at the same time establish real boundaries in order to establish a particular ethos in a particular space. These are really open-ended questions that Integral has suffered through, and we're all going to keep suffering through as we try to refine the skill of how to do that. The other thing I think we're going to keep facing going forward is our relationship to terminology, right? So when I first got attracted to this, I thought, well, Wilber has a way of talking about some of the things I'm interested in. I better at least learn how to say that. I need to know that language. But whenever there's a language, people are internally divided. Should I go all in on this language? Is it important for us to have the new words for new precision and new clarity? Or should we be careful that we don't get caught in those words, right? Like, what's going to be the new label for our community? What's going to be the new way of discussing stages and development? Are we a community where we never settle, where we've always got several competing terms circulating to maintain our freedom? Or do we need to consolidate on certain terminology in order to have power and precision and solidarity? And I don't think we quite know the answer to that. And I think we see it we're in such a marketing culture right now that we face this around almost every aspect of society. If a word becomes unfashionable or unpalatable or contaminated because of some socio-ethical or political or historical phenomenon, do we try to keep it going? Do we rehabilitate it? Do we add our best thinking into it? Or do we say, well, that's contaminated, we're going to switch to this new phrasing now? So I think these two questions of how do we create the right inclusion-exclusion membranes, and how do we handle our natural dichotomy around language and terminology, these will be with us going forward.
Yeah. So I mean, there were a lot of confusing things that happened in and through the Integral community and this whole world of thinking, and how it attracts people, creates a strong response, strong experience, and then of course also weirdly is efficient in different ways, right? So yeah, I think there's some kind of cosmic battle to be had for the soul of integral, right? The marriage of sense and soul, right? They're not married yet. They're dating, and it's on and off. And sometimes sense, or no, I should say, sometimes soul has a huge affair, right, on sense's expense, right? And that's one of the things I like. If we want to drink from a pure chalice, we need to not fool ourselves, right? And people are fooling themselves. Like, I talk to respected integralists, or people who don't necessarily call themselves that, but they will call themselves, well, influenced by integralism, etc. And they will say, so my next big project is I'm going to research the number of the dates you're born and how that influences your life, and we're getting lots of research money for that. It's really fascinating. It's my new research frontier, and really where we can see subtle energies working, etc. And it's like, it's not real. It's just not real. You're bullshitting yourself. I'm like, and we need an integral community, not where we're rude to one another, and we're not open, but that just doesn't lead more and more people down those paths, right? And unfortunately, those are strong attractors. And the same person will be saying, I'm drinking this and that vitamin supplement, and they're part of like this pyramid marketing scheme, right? Then this is these are respected people in the integral community. We have a problem, right? Or we, like the non-nominal integral community, who are like pushing off of integral and, not being like, well, and all of that stuff. Like, but these are problematic behaviors. Like, I didn't say anything to that front, maybe because, well, it's not such a close friend. Yeah. So those things, as long as those things exist in substantial amounts and are integral to integral, its promise cannot be fulfilled. Intelligent people will walk in the door, they'll get a whiff of some of that, they'll go look elsewhere for meaning of life and for integration of knowledge, right? So I don't think that necessarily leads us to David Long's project. I don't necessarily think it leads to my own project of metamodernism, but I do think good enough next level models, like core models. My models are kind of applied theory, like real pure theory or meta theory models, and not even just models, a whole research subject on these things, right? A whole discipline, a transdisciplinary discipline that needs to grow, that needs to become, like, we need to open up the methodology so that that, I think, is the real future of the real integral, the real marriage of sense and soul. Other things that I feel are concerns, that I feel are important for the integral community, or whatever we want to call this larger thing, this larger pattern of patterns, is actually the whole global. I don't mean this in like any accusatory way or any politically correct way, but we do have a male problem and we have a global north problem. That's and we do see that the pathways of these integration pathways do go in ways that weren't necessarily predictable from the conventional developmental frameworks, right? So why is Costa Rica the first country to adopt an inner development goals framework, which is, young and being tried out and stuff, but basically this is pure applied integral theory, just a few generations later, right? Or iterations later. Well, that's not what was expected, right? You'd expect Finland, right? Or Sweden or Switzerland, right? So there is something. And of course, the male thing, then even further one, but this one is more on the positive side. There is something about neurotypicality here. There's just no way it's coincidence that, like, I get to know this interesting person. They've read my books. I read some of their stuff. I like them, right? And they're saying interesting things. And 2 months, 4 months down the road, I see a Facebook post, I see something else, an email, and they say, well, because I have ADHD, or I'm a highly functional autist, or something along those lines, right? And I don't have any of those things myself diagnostically, but it's, I mean, that there is a spread in terms of unusual minds, right? Unusual minds with unusual qualities, and somehow there's a certain role for those unusual minds in the evolution of humanity, etc. And that has some kind of, I'm not sure what, but it has some kind of connection, and it's probably a complex one with different aspects to it. But there's some kind of connection between that and the future of integral, because and not just integral, metamodernism, complexity theory, etc., Cynthianism, game B, and I think that could become a little bit clearer as well. So those are things. And there, if we would have had the same discussion for metamodernism, I would have said slightly other things. But like, there's some real homework to be done in terms of particularly the magical thinking and its membrane, and that has to do with core inventions that still have to be made. And then there are these social aspects, which, yeah, I mean, white male and all that, and of course this, like, how is this connected to viewing, just getting the side view of things, right? Those are the horizons I kind of feel at this point.
Yeah, I don't know, Bruce, if you want to jump in here, or if you're thinking of kind of wrapping us up, because I have two more thoughts I might add, but I don't know.
I'll have a brief thing I'll say, and yeah, I think I know that we probably should wrap it up soon. I think we're opening up some stuff that we could see. There's a lot more to explore here if we wanted.
Yeah, I meant mine as a kind of closing statement. Yeah.
Okay. Good. Yeah, I had a kind of general question for you in terms of, is there any interest or is it happening that some academic conferences are being organized around, metamodernism in the way that it has been around integral theory? I know that there's still the integral theory conference going on in Europe. My impression, a little bit from a distance, is it seems a little bit less academic than the ones that were happening in the United States for several years running. I found that there was a lot of generativity to those conferences, and they actually revealed a much wider scope of what's going on the ground in terms of application of integral theory around the world. We had people from India and Africa and all over the place who are using integral theory in different contexts, and most of them were not woo contexts. They were, industrial planning, and environmental engineering and medicine and things like that. So there was I think it was a good exposure that we don't get the same impression of what integral is or is doing if we're only paying attention to social media. We really see a pretty skewed picture. And at the conferences, you can get a better idea of what a serious application looks like and get a better sense of the scope that's actually there. And it's a shame that that's kind of dried up from my own experience here. But I think they're generative, and I think, if it's happening for metamodernism, that would be great.
Yeah, so just to reply briefly, I mean, I followed at a distance over link the conference. I think it was in 2013, must have been San Francisco, and it was amazing, right? It was, Bhaskar was alive, he was there. It was amazing. I'm actually writing written afterward for a book that edited by Sean Asbjørn Hargens and Nick Hedlund, and where I comment some on that. And then there are the European conferences, and like you say, yeah, it's a lot more woo-woo and a lot less academic. And yeah, well, basically, soul having an affair behind senses back, right? And metamodernism at this point, you can see a traction point in academia. Young people write to me sometimes, and they're like, "Hey, I'm doing my master's thesis. It's in English literature. It's in this and that." But there are at this point almost no professorships or anything like that. What you do have is cultural metamodernism, like the Dutch school, where we kind of Shanghai the term from to begin with to place it alongside integralism. They have their conferences on pop culture and on the arts, etc. I do think metamodernism needs to, if integralism was this particular, it did have a certain feel or vibe to it, or does, but I think that vibe kind of has lost some of its luster to most of us, or some of its aliveness. Metamodernism is still kind of finding its corresponding vibe, so it can, flutter and shine for some years and then lose its luster as things do. But I think the future of it would be event creation. Well, a metamodern festival with several days of highly experiential art forms, participatory art forms, and then of course a lot of networking on that, and resulting in some summit meetings at the end of it, where you can partake in make metamodernish projects part of your life in other regards, right? But if we want to go, I think the future would be to be as experiential as these fairly woo-woo European integral conferences, but without actual ontological transgressions, if you put it like that. I think within that, I would hope there would be a role for theory, but I think metamodernism may not actually be the vehicle of itself for the future of real theoretical work. Yes, certainly. So I'll be keeping working on that, and other people do as well. But I think like the discipline that wants to emerge is some kind of meta theory discipline, right? Mm-hmm. With metamodernism is of course a commentary on a certain cultural vibe and a certain stage, etc. And I think the future of like the next torchbearer for that kind of thing would be the creation of some kind of transdisciplinary meta-theoretical discipline, which has, discipline, has methods, has a language, has academic standards, but at the same time manages to be as holistic and comprehensive as Integral tried to be, and is metamodern in its cultural expressional vibe, right? But it isn't necessarily about metamodernism and metamodernity, right? And that's unfortunately not yet emerging, but all three of us are working towards that, and slowly and surely.
Yeah, there's the theory aspect and the culture aspect, right? So I think metamodernism is still a wide open concept from the culture point of view, and it will have some complementary meta theory space. But the book that Jonathan and I put together on metamodernism, it's sort of striking a balance between character and flavor and politics and academia. Nobody's criticized it on not being academic and intellectual enough. The only critiques have been, why isn't it more experiential? Why isn't it more political? Right? So the people are looking to metamodernism for that cultural and sociological aspect, and we'll be looking to something else to do the really intense theory work. And that theory work, I think, one of the things we haven't addressed too much are which elements in Wilber's model of integral pluralism might be connected to some of these problems we're talking about, right? I have some real issues around the way states and stages are deployed. I have some real issues around the way the second tier is conceptualized, right? Some of these things may have to be changed to stop producing the kinds of outputs we've been seeing. But in terms of some things Daniel was saying that I really agree with, I think there's, in the attempt to, say, jump from first to second tier or from green to yellow or teal, all these kind of terms, there's been an undervaluing of what the ongoing green or postmodern culture code has to offer, because it's still unfolding. And when we say, look, we don't have enough appreciation of neurodiversity or of imbalance and bias and historical diversity and ecology and the need for economic change, these are all sort of classic progressive postmodern concerns, and they're continuing to unfold. They're learning new languages, they're getting deeper, they're more powerful, and we have to continue to integrate them and not just assume we've already jumped past them and don't need to hear from them anymore. Because there's a lot of stuff, when we're trying to put together a map of all the different lenses, we need to take seriously distortions in lenses. We need to take seriously background issues. We need our stage models to be way more fluid and more complex than they've been, if they're going to remain in place at all. So I think that's a big problem. And I think also there's been a tendency to be to not understand and not make clear the difference between, say, integration and blurring, right? And this gets to what Daniel was saying, because there's a spot for all these things. If somebody wants to explore numerology, okay, but where does that go? That's not in the same domain as science and theory and analysis. Now, you may want to experimentally see if you can cross different domains. That's great. But there need to be very careful membranes around that so that we don't think experimental blending and integrating gives you freedom to just blur the differences between all these zones. So we need a good theory and also the sensibility that says that has a metacognitive space to go, where does this go? Where is this okay? Because it's not okay in any of these 4 areas. It might be okay in these 2 areas. But we need to police that a little bit better and have a theory that empowers us to do that.
I would give a plug for, many years ago, Gary Hampson wrote an article called "The Way Out is the Way Through." And it gave voice to a feeling that a lot of us had at that time, including me. I used to comment on it a lot, which was the green bashing was unhealthy and it was totally missing. It was looking at a kind of an aberrant expression of certain postmodern attitudes in culture and totally missing really a lot of the complexity and depth of what was going on under the aegis of postmodern theorizing. And there's a lot there that gets skipped over. And yeah, the way out is the way through, I think is what the article was called, but it's a really great sensitive treatment for looking at what an actual integration of the postmodern with whatever is emerging would look like, and how they would facilitate each other. Big yes to everything else you said. So I think we're probably at our time limit. I don't think we're at our subject limit, but I think we're at our time limit. So yeah, I think it's been useful to touch into this. I think, I don't know if we came to any final conclusion, except that I think we largely share a number of the same sentiments and concerns, and maybe we have a little bit different strategies for how to navigate them. But I think, it's been fruitful to explore together.
Likewise.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Felt really good.